Morning, Asians! Wonderful people of Asia. As literature began to be part of our daily lives, different countries are enlightened about this work. Are you wondering why am I wearing this kind of suit? Oh, yes, it's simply because I am going to present the literatures in Asia. Welcome to Asian literature. Asian literature is one of the influences and gathered many countries in Asia. Primarily, these are the poetry and prose writings produced in a variety of languages in Asia. As religion and politics influenced Asian communities, Asian literature worked for emulating its development. Being the world's largest continent, its scope is wide for us to research. By its technical term, it is basically the literary products made in continent Asia throughout history. Asian literature reflects the similarities in customs and traditions of Africa and Asian countries, their philosophies of life, and the struggles and successes of their developing nations and its people. Asian literature can be divided into a host of different labels, categorized according to religion, zone, region, ethnic group, literary genre, historical perspective, or language origin. Wanna know the Chinese literature? Hop on the country of China.
Ni hao. Welcome to China. Chinese literature is one of the major literary heritage of the world, with an uninterrupted history of more than 3,000 years, dating back at least to the 40th century BCE. The Chinese language remains its unmistakable identity in its words and words, in spite of generally changes in pronunciation, and the existence of regional and local dialects, and several stages in the structural representation of the written drops or characteristics. China has endured its attributes of keeping the fundamental of its identity very firm. The Tang Dynasty is the best era of Chinese literature because the poets like Tu Fu, Ti Fu, and Wang Wei created landmark works. Through cultural contact, Chinese literature are influenced the literary traditions of other Asian countries, particularly Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Not only was the Chinese script adapted for the written language in these countries, but some writers adapted the Chinese language as their chief literary medium at least before the 20th century. Has also influenced the development of Chinese literature. The fact that each graph had a monophonetic pronunciation in each context created many homonyms, which lead to misunderstanding and confusion when it's spoken or read aloud without the aid of the drops. Another trivia about Chinese literature is that Chinese poetry, besides depending on end rhyme and total meter for its cadence, is characterized by its compactness and brevity.
Introducing Lipo and Tufu, being respected poets from the Tiang Dynasty period, competed heavily with one another, but they have been called friends by many scholars. In fact, many of the poems written by the two are directed towards the other. Each of these poets uses emotions and experiences in the Tiang Dynasty of China to create poems that illustrate and comment on many different aspects of ancient Chinese life. Also, both employ similar key images.
I am one of the most popular Chinese poets, was noted for my romantic songs on wine, women, and nature. My writings reflect the grandeur of the Tiang Dynasty at the height of its prosperity. I was born in Central Asia, where my ancestors had lived in exiles since the early 7th century.
I was a great Chinese poet of the Tang Dynasty. He is known as a poet-historian for his portrayal of the social and political disorders of his time, and is also noted for his artistry and craftsmanship. Hapon, Japan.
Konnichiwa! Japanese literature plays as one of the major literatures in the world, both in quantity and in quality, like in age, vibrancy, and capacity to English literature, although its pattern of improvement has been somewhat different. The surviving works comprise a literary tradition extending from the 17th century CE to the present. The earliest writing of literature in Japanese was motivated by impact from China. One of the renowned poetic forms is haiku, a short descriptive poem with 17 syllables and various theatrical genres, namely the Noh and the Kabuki. Still, the text entirely in Japanese depicts an exceptional range of styles. The complexities of interpreting Japanese literature can barely be exaggerated. Even a specialist in the one period is likely to have trouble deciphering a work from another period or genre. Japanese style has always favored vagueness, and the elements of speech required for easy understanding of a statement are often included as unnecessary or actually persist. Despite the great problem occurring from such qualities of style, Japanese literature of all periods is extremely interesting to modern-day readers, whether read in the original or in translation, because it is a prevailing person and colored by an emotional rather than intellectual or moralistic mood. Its themes are a universal quality almost unchanged by time. Another trivia about Japanese literature. Early works of Japanese literature were heavily influenced by cultural contact with China and Chinese literature, and were often written of classical Chinese.
Presenting Matsuo Basho, 1644 to 1694, was one of the greatest Japanese poets. He elevated haiku to the level of serious poetry in numerous anthologies and travel diaries. The name of Matsuo Basho is associated especially with the celebrated Genroku era.
I am one of the most famous poets of Edo period in Japan. During my lifetime, Basho was recognized for his works in collaborative haiku no renga form. Today, after centuries of commentary, he is recognized as the greatest master of haiku. One of my most famous haiku: a old pond, frog jump in, sound of water.
Great! You already done watching Japanese literature. Now let's proceed to Korean literature. Yabasaya! Did you know that Korean literature, also known as body of works written by the Koreans, at first in classical Chinese, later in various transcription systems using Chinese characters, and finally in Hangul, which is their language after all. Korea had its own language for several thousand years. Since the mid-15th century, it has a writing system only when Hangul was invented. Beside on, early literary activity was in Chinese characters. Korean scholars were writing poetry in the traditional manner of classical Chinese at least by the 40th century CE. By the 7th century, Idu, a system had been devised that allowed Koreans to make rough transliterations of Chinese texts. Eventually, certain Chinese characters were used for their poetic value to represent Korean particles of speech and inflectional endings. In general, this literature written in Korea falls into three categories. First, works written in the early transcription systems, those written in Hangul and those written in Chinese. There are four major traditional poetic forms in Korean literature, such as Hyanga, which means native songs. Poems were written in 4, 8, or 10 lines. The 10th line form comprising 2 4-line stanzas and a concluding 2-line stanza, and this poetic form was the most popular and oldest form in Korean literature. Second, Pyeolgok, which means special songs. Our changes flourished during the Middle and Late Koryo period. It is characterized by a refrain either in the middle or at the end of each stanza. The theme of most of these anonymous poems is love, the joys and torments of which are expressed in frank and powerful language. The third one is Sijo, which means current melodies. It is the longest enduring and most popular form of Korean poetry. There are 3-line poems in Sijo, which each line has 14 to 16 syllables, and the total number of syllables seldom exceeds. Each line consists of groups of 4 syllables. Sidyo may deal with Confucian ethical values, but there are also many poems about nature and love. And lastly, kasa, which means verses. This tends to be much more longer than other forms of Korean poetry and is usually written in balanced couplets. During the earlier period, the poem was generally about 100 lines long and dealt with such subjects as female beauty, war, and seclusion. In addition, in other system, kugyol or abridged versions of Chinese characters were used to denote grammatical elements and were inserted into text during transcriptions. And finally, existing literary works indicate before the 20th century, much of Korean literature was written in Chinese rather than in Korean even after the invention of Hangul.
He wrote over 1,000 poems over more than 60 years and had considerable influence on Korean literature, being considered the founding father of modern Korean poetry. Under the pen name Midang, he published at least 15 collections of poetry. His works have been translated into several languages, including English, French, Spanish, and German.
Seo Jun-gyu. I was a Korean poet, university professor who wrote under the pen name Midang. I'm widely considered as one of the best poets in 20th century Korean literature and was nominated 5 times for the Nobel Prize in Literature. One of my famous poems, In the Field Filling Up with Snow. It's alright, it's alright, it's alright. The snowflakes fall in heaps, embracing even the sound of baby pheasant and quails returning to their nests. It's alright, it's alright, it's alright, it's alright. The snowflakes fall like a fluffy cotton, embracing even the sound of young girls with their rosy cheeks returning to their nests. It's embrace even the sound of the virgins returning home. The crying, the laughing, the bird was now getting up strongly. To the big ones, big tear trays. To the small ones, small laugh lines, the sound of big stories and small stories.
Now, let's proceed to the last literature that we discussed today. It's Indian literature, Namaskar. As far as we know, the original Indian literature took the form of the canonic Hindu, sacred writings recognized as the Veda, which were written in Sanskrit. To the Veda were added prose notes such as the Brahmanas and Upanishads. In addition to holy and moral writings, such genres as suggestive and religious lyrics, court poetry, plays, and narrative folk tales surfaced. Furthermore, other related languages appeared in the modern languages of northern India from this. The literature of those languages varied largely on the ancient Indian experience, which consists of 2 Sanskrit epic poems, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, as well as the Bhagavata Purana and the other Puranas. The South Indian language of the Tamil is an exemption to this form Sanskrit influence, since it had classical practice of its own. Urdu and Sindhi are other exceptions. Therefore, the beginning in 19th century, especially during the height of British control over the subcontinent, although Western literary models had an impact on Indian literature. The most remarkable result being the launch of the used language, both on a major scale. Lastly, the text began to be embraced by Indian writers, as did realism and an attraction in social question and psychological explanation. A practiced literature in English was also recognized in the subcontinent.
Bengali poet, short story writer, song composer, playwright, essayist, and painter who introduced new prose and verse forms in the use of colloquial language into Bengali literature, thereby freeing it from traditional models based on classical Sanskrit.
I was a Bengali poet, writer, composer, philosopher, and painter. I reshaped Bengali literature and music, as well as Indian art with contextual modernism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of my famous poems, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms toward perfections, where the dear stream of reason has not lost.
Hey, are you now interested in Asian literature? No problem. We will now recommend you some Asian books to make you more interested in Asia. Let's start with
First, Little Fires Everywhere and Everything I Never Told You. Second, An Amber in the Ashes, Torch Against the Night, and Reaper at the Gates. Third, The Way You Make Me Feel. Fourth, If I Had Your Face. Fifth, The Namesake. Sixth, Emergency Contact. 7. Love from A to Z. 8. To All the Boys I Loved Before, watch on Netflix. 9. The Poppy War. 10. Saga. 11. Warcross, The Young Elite's Legend.
See you in the cosmos! A very large expanse of Nasita Herring. Crazy Rich Asian. Dragon Bird. The Astonishing Color of the After. Flame in the Mist. The Wart and the Dawn. And the Rose and the Dagger. The Kiss Ocean.